Hello, my name's Jane Crask, and I'm a tutor at the Queen's Foundation in Birmingham. I'm going to talk a little bit about doing theology in the tradition of the Wesleys. I can remember reading some of John Wesley's sermons when I was about 19 or 20. I just started training as a local preacher. I was beginning on note and then on trial, and it seemed an important part of the tradition to read some of these important sermons. I remember finding them strange. I was an English literature student, so the older style language didn't faze me. I found them compelling in some respects, enlightening in others, and depressing. The constant references to sin, to whether or not the listeners were real Christians or not, I think provoked some anxiety. I couldn't imagine them being preached either. So I left them for a while and came back later. What do we do with the heritage of John Wesley, of Charles Wesley, of their mother Susanna, and much of early Methodism? Should we know by heart some of Charles Wesley's hymns or Susanna's prayers or some of John's sermons even? I could probably manage selected verses of some of the hymns, but not much more. What do we do with this heritage? And it is important what we do with it if we're Methodists. And there are also some riches for people who aren't as well. And there are questions for all sorts of people. More than 2 decades ago, I was involved in a project which became the book Methodism and the Future. The people who wrote the book were all under 40 at the time and are not anymore. Those involved were a limited and not sufficiently diverse group of people, many of whom were engaged with the Methodist Church at the time. Wondering why it mattered to us and what its future might be, at least in Britain. What was characteristic enough or valuable enough about Methodism carry on into the future? That was part of a question of identity that people were already wrestling with at the time and probably have been ever since and probably were before. I suspect our interest in Methodist identity, for those of us who are Methodist or perhaps involved with Methodist churches, can be linked to 2 things. One is our anxiety about decline. Will we go out of business? The other, more positively, is because the societies and cultures around us have become more interested in aspects of identity that were perhaps put to the side previously. So in terms of age or ethnicity or gender or sexuality or geographical region or the aspects of culture that never used to be given very much attention. What is it to be Methodist? What part does the heritage and the tradition of past Methodism, and particularly early Methodism, play in that? Currently, I work with Methodist student ministers, and I'm teaching a course called Preparing for Denominational Ministry. So ministry in a particular denomination or tradition that is Methodism in Britain at the moment, but in relation to other traditions and to Methodism globally as well. In an early session of that course, we talk about what we think is distinctive about Methodism. Is it the welcome we found in a particular place? Is it the tradition we think of as the open table at communion? Is it the role of lay people? Is it the way Methodists are connected with each other? Is it the different kinds of ministries that are enabled in Methodism? Is it the covenant service, singing, a host of other things? And then when we dig into those, we try to understand a bit more, which are really distinctive, which would other traditions claim as well, which are relatively recent and would not have been part of early Methodism, which of them were borrowed from other traditions by John Wesley or others. And sometimes it's not easy to locate what's really distinctive, except perhaps by a combination of a number of those things. Often in the course, we find we need to know more about the past traditions of Methodism. And people come and realise that there is much about Methodism's past that they haven't come across, even if some of them have been attending Methodist churches for a long time. It's been said that Methodism in Britain maybe over time became much less interested in the heritage of the Wesleys themselves specifically. And perhaps some of that interest was reignited by scholarship more recently from other places like North America or maybe other parts of the world. There would also be plenty of British historians and scholars of the Wesleys who've been working on this area all their lives and have a heritage of that too. Let's take an example of a discussion I've heard a lot in recent years in Methodism in Britain, which relates to early Methodism. I think there's been a focus in recent years on small groups, and Methodists have remembered the phenomenal success of the band and class meetings in John Wesley's organisation of early Methodism, perhaps based even in the experience of groups that were gathered by his father or his mother at Epworth. What then sometimes happens is that we make a series of steps very quickly. I simplify slightly. It worked then. Let's put it into practice again now, and we will see the amazing growth that came about in 18th century Methodism. But a bit more close attention to history might make us ask more questions. There are plenty of occasions in which, even in John Wesley's lifetime, he was exhorting people to meet in class because they'd stopped or hadn't even started or weren't engaged well enough. The class meeting clearly declined within and beyond early Methodism, and bands had declined before that. Why might that have been? Some scholars suggest that a pattern that worked well for the early converts in Methodism didn't work so well for those who were born into it or growing up in Methodism. It was maybe better for one kind of experience than another. And if we look at small groups now in churches, they might have similar functions from that in John Wesley's time. They might have very different functions. They might have still aspects that work brilliantly and others that are different kinds of problems. We can't automatically read off from one context to the other. And that's it. To analyse these things, we need to take seriously differences of context. We don't live in 18th century England. The societies we're part of are very different from the Epworth or Oxford or London or Bristol or Newcastle or America or other parts of the world in the Wesleys' days. Does that mean, though, that we cut ourselves off from those past contexts? I don't think it does. It matters that we think between contexts. Why did that happen in that time and place? What from that might be of use and insight to us? What is God bringing to our attention if we look at the tradition that we're part of? What might be disclosed if we dig deeper? What might need to be adapted and changed for our different context? I want to encourage people from many traditions to explore the Wesleys, their prayers and hymns and sermons and letters and their context, the effect they had on the society around them, and to learn from those riches. But I don't believe that means we slavishly repeat what they said or did in our context. I think we're much more likely to pick up strands and themes and ways of doing church and ways of thinking about Christian faith, much more likely to hold on to those things than we are to repeat their understanding of doctrine, their exact language, or their organisation and structure. And the plug is that I've recently written a Grove booklet to try and explore this, doing theology in the tradition of the Wesleys. Susanna Wesley's methods of educating and disciplining her children, or Charles Wesley's methods for dealing with conflict, or some of John Wesley's leadership practices, these may not be things we want to copy, though we might learn from them. Similarly, though perhaps more controversially, we may not be wanting to repeat John Wesley's understanding of sin or baptism, or the way he read the scriptures, or even aspects of Charles Wesley's theology of the Lord's Supper. Yet there are things to learn as we shape practices and theological reflection for our own contexts. So, for instance, let's think about why hymn singing was so important to early Methodists, how and why they sang their faith, how they used that particular form to express something of the heart and of the head. And let's think from that about how we sing our faith in words that make sense today, and how we still emphasize God's grace and our wonder at all that salvation might mean. Words and music that still allow us to offer and express our wonder, love, and praise. Let's think about why it was so important for people to talk about faith together, to talk together about how they experienced and understood God, and about how that should shape their lives and their actions and their commitments. Let's think about how people encouraged one another to love God and their neighbour better. And then let's think how we might do something similar. Let's think about why it was so important to tell the good news in the 18th century, how it was done then, and the best ways to do that now if we want to communicate with as many as we can. It probably won't be sermons preached in the marketplace. Let's be interested in the heritage of early Methodism. Let's be prepared to learn from it for Christian disciples today. And let's adapt it appropriately, rather than trying to go back and repeat it. Let's look at methods and overall priorities and get into the heart of the matter, rather than replicating the exact language or the conception that was used in the 18th century. And if we're going to discern what are appropriate adaptations or not, we'll need to work on that with lots of others, Methodists and non-Methodists. Might that be what it is to do theology in the tradition of the Wesleys?